am concerned the VA would fail to determine whether Ms. Morad's conduct made VA employees of Jewish faith feel unwelcome at work. Because of these concerns, I requested VA provide all documents associated with the investigation so I could see if the VA was trying to sweep the issue under the rug. After over 4 months, numerous requests and negotiations, VA finally agreed to provide the investigative documents in camera. Unfortunately, contents affirm my concerns. Through the committee and camera review, the committee identified several troubling aspects of VA's supposed investigation. For example, the VA only interviewed one person, Ms. Morad, before determining that there was no wrongdoing. Even worse, the interview with Ms. Morad was not documented in any way, which seems to violate a VA's own regulation for conducting investigations. Additionally, VA's investigation did not examine whether Ms. Morad's work produced or OGC practice group were negatively affected by her actions and beliefs. Further, when VA examined whether Ms. Morad's actions were anti-Semitic, VA used Wikipedia to get the definition of anti-Semitic definition. Now let me say, the committee has an obligation to perform oversight to see if any changes are needed to ensure VA only conducts adequate investigations and prevents anti-Semitism in all its forms moving forward. As such, I request transcribed interviews with the VA employees who directed or conducted the investigation and approved the investigation's final report. These interviews would help the committee better understand the investigative process VA used and were there in the room for improvement. Although the VA had previously refused to make the relevant employees available for interview, VA finally agreed to interviews yesterday morning. And I'm glad to say that after 4 months of negotiation, VA has decided to stop hindering Congress from investigating and will allow the committee to conduct its oversight duties. However, like I said back in April, if the Secretary decides to reverse course and try to hinder my investigation, I will not hesitate to call up another subpoena. Anti-Semitism has and continues to be on the rise around the country, and we have a sacred obligation, I believe, to combat it no matter what. For my part, as chairman of this committee, I will continue to do on behalf of my fellow Jewish veterans and their families, and I will continue to do that. I hope that once our investigation concludes that we can ensure that this administration will do the same. Now, turning to the VA decision to give huge bonuses to senior executives. Last year, I learned about VA's decision to provide these bonuses to senior executives, not because they were hardworking or because they were particularly good at servicing veterans, but just because they were already VA's highest paid top brass, making on an average of more than $200,000 each year. Earlier this month, VA Office of the Inspector General published a report that made clear this was no mistake, but a long calculated plan. The report shows the Secretary McDonnell purposefully delegated his authority to award critical skill incentive bonuses to several of his trusted deputies, all of which are political appointees. After being delegated authority, his most senior leaders, including Dr. Eldenhall and Mr. Jacobs, started to make plans to give every one of their senior executive a bonus. Now, I appreciate that everyone loves to give hard workers and who earn an earned bonus, but 90% of VA employees weren't given a penny. Yet, Dr. Elnahar and Mr. Jacobs decided to give each of their senior executives an extra $50,000 if they had the pleasure of serving as bureaucrats in the VA's DC central office. They even got an extra $60,000. There are VA nurses in my district in Southern Illinois whose whole salary is less than $60,000 a year. Yet, The Biden administration ignored the public servants who work and serve the veterans daily. Instead, the administration decided pushing paper in D.C. was a critical skill to VA mission that was worthy of maximum bonuses. And don't be fooled, this money could have been spent on hardworking VA employees outside the Beltway who might have used it to, let's say, send a son or daughter to college, not to buy a new Porsche. The OIG report makes it clear that this wasn't some flash-in-the-pan decision. Senior executives at central office took 6 months of paper pushing to ensure they got these bonuses with little to no justification. Mr. Secretary, in September, you called this decision a policy error. I call this behavior criminal. In fact, the Office of Inspector General agrees, referring 9 VA senior leaders to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. Unsurprisingly, the Biden administration U.S. Attorney's Office has so far refused to even investigate the self-dealing bonuses. And Mr. Secretary, I specifically did not invite you to testify today. You basically invited yourself, but the ball is now in your court. Now, I know that some of the bonuses have been clawed back, but as far as I can see, the same leaders who allowed, planned, and made these poor decisions remain in power. With the VA's current leadership in place, I am sure many veterans are wondering whether your leadership team is focused on selfless service or self-service. I'm sure I am wondering this. Mr. Secretary, ultimately, the responsibility for the failures falls on your shoulders. And if the leaders below you fail and are not held accountable, you must be held accountable. Last week, my team met with a senior VA official who is a selfless servant. He was shocked by VA's decision to pay its senior executives first, expressing that in the military, leaders always eat last. He told us that this situation had serious damage to VA employees' morale. VA employees feel betrayed and let down. Senior executives feel jerked around and left out to dry. Ultimately, the employees expressed frustration that they don't see VA's culture being fixed under the current leadership. Mr. Secretary, I look forward to hearing from you today about how the Biden administration plans to hold its leaders, and not just you, accountable for their action. We've done a lot of work to change the culture at VA and attract veterans who want to serve veterans. I know them, and you know them. I would hate to see them throw that all away. With that, I now recognize Ranking Member Takano for his opening comments.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Implementation of the PACT Act as a whole is going well, and more veterans are being connected with the care and benefits they have earned. On May 21st, VA announced it had granted 1 million PACT Act-related claims. More than 880,000 veterans and survivors are now receiving new service-connected disability benefits. More than 5.4 million veterans have received free screenings for toxic exposure from VA. I commend the Secretary and the Department for the overall successful and unprecedentedly swift implementation of the PACT Act, which will help even more veterans access the care and benefits they have earned in the future. The PACT Act authorized critical skill incentives, or CSIs, and I am concerned also about VA's initial missteps in awarding some of them. However, it is important to highlight that this represents a mere 0.3% of the total CSIs awarded under PACT Act authorities, underscoring the need for corrective measures without undermining the overall effectiveness of the program. And while the department is successfully utilizing the CSI authority to retain employees with high demand skills, the CFO brought to the Secretary's attention concerns about how these incentives are being used at the executive level. The Secretary then notified Congress and asked the VA Office of Inspector General to investigate this matter. The OIG reported on how VA officials could have interpreted better and carried out the authority to grant CSIs. This investigation also revealed that there were employees who recognized and questioned whether the issuance of these incentives, was valid and raised concerns. I'm grateful to those VA leaders and employees who voiced their concerns, and I am grateful to Secretary McDonough for heeding those warnings, course-correcting and self-reporting to the Inspector General, and promptly informing Congress once he became aware of the issues. And this is how the process should work. However, as the Inspector General's investigation pointed out, there were missed opportunities for leaders to better vet the recommendations for critical skills incentives for central office executives. Many of those missed opportunities were consequences of VA's decentralized oversight functions related to governance and risk management. As the Inspector General noted, the VA Operations Board and VA Executive Board should have reviewed the plan for the executive incentives to understand the risks before issuance. So I do look forward to VA reviewing its governance policies and clarifying roles and responsibilities for all involved in approving critical skills incentives to ensure better compliance with statute in the future. It is clear that VA must put in place strong internal controls to ensure congressional intent is followed when new authorities are being implemented. And one of the deficiencies that the Inspector General's investigation found was that the VA Office of General Counsel was not consulted early or adequately enough during the process to identify potential issues with how VHA and VBA planned to award CSIs to central office senior executives. When the Office of General Counsel was engaged, VA and VBA leaders did not ask questions that would have necessarily raised flags for the attorneys responding to those inquiries. The General Counsel's advice and guidance should be central to legislative implementation. Attorneys should be weighing in early and often as VA develops plans to carry out congressional mandates. This investigation has made it abundantly clear that VA needs a Senate-confirmed General Counsel. The nomination of Anjali Chaturvedi has been held up in the Senate for nearly 2 years. It is long past time for VA to have steady leadership in that role to advise the department and develop processes and policies to ensure compliance with the law. Now, I want to underscore why we authorize these critical skills incentives in the first place and why I will advocate for similar retention bonuses in the future. We simply must ensure that VA has the robust workforce it needs to care for our veterans. We also must ensure VA can be competitive in the healthcare talent marketplace so that they can both attract and keep employees. Institutional knowledge is invaluable and irreplaceable, and VA needs flexibility to compete with local markets and meet ever-changing needs across different clinical and high-demand positions. In the vast majority of instances when critical skills incentives have been used, they have been successful in retaining VA employees. As I noted, the incentives at issue here represent less than 0.5% of the total awards made through the PACT Act. The 99.7% of the incentives that are not at issue today support occupations that face significant staffing shortages, as well as individuals who possess high-demand skills. Now, these are not only for clinicians, but for high-demand and hard-to-fill occupations like housekeepers, police, and human resource professionals. And with the increase of new health care enrollments and new benefit claims following the PACT Act, it is vital VA has the staff it needs to support veterans already using VA and those newly entering the system. The PACT Act is not the first time Congress granted VA authorities to keep critical employees. The Mission Act, the Choice Act, Isaacson Roe, and the VA Choice and Quality Employment Act all included staff retention tools. These authorities have been used successfully for years to bolster the VA workforce. And while the missteps VA made here are disappointing, I have faith that VA can and will use the critical skills incentives authorized in the PACT Act as Congress intends, as they have done for years with the many other authorities we have granted. So I look forward to hearing from Secretary McDonough about how VA is aggressively implementing the Inspector General's recommendations, and I hope to hear how the Secretary will ensure Congress, VA employees, and veterans have confidence in how the agency is remedying concerns arising from this investigation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and I thank you for your opening statement. And I want to, first off, by apologizing to everyone. Votes have been called, but this would be probably the best place to allow us to go and make those votes. So we will stand in recess. I do apologize to both panels and the witnesses that are here today. We will vote. So everyone knows we have 2 votes. After the second vote, we will reconvene within 10 minutes after the second vote. So thank you. In recess. We'll come back to order. At this time, our first panel, we have the Honorable Michael J. Missel, Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Mr. Missel, can you come forward? And before you sit down, we'll do the process of swearing you in. How about that? Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to provide is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you, and let the record reflect the witness has answered in the affirmative. Mr. Missel, you are recognized for your 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Bost, Ranking Member Takano, and committee members. On May 9th, the OIG published a report on VA's improper award of $10.8 million in critical skill incentives to senior executives in the VA Central Office, or VACO. The awards were granted to VHA and VBA senior executives at the maximum percentage allowed under the PACT Act, 25% of basic pay. Awards range from nearly $39,000 to over $100,000, with 7 that exceeded $100,000. The PACT Act authorized VA to award CSIs to those staff who possessed a high-demand skill or skill that is at shortage. Unlike the vast majority of CSIs awarded to non-executive staff in shortage occupations, such as housekeepers and police, the CSIs for VACO senior executives were based on possessing high-demand skills. The only justification provided by VHA to support the CSI awards to their 148 senior executives was a short, identical paragraph on a single form. This justification cited a much more competitive job market, resulting in a high demand of skills possessed by their experienced executive leadership team. There wasn't much more to it. VBA provided a bit more analysis on its form, and in a supporting memo, compared its senior executives to private sector CEOs. The National Cemetery Administration declined to award CSIs to its senior executive because, as one leader stated, they did not believe that they had a justifiable reason to do so. Our work found lapses in governance, judgment, due diligence, communications, and accountability at multiple levels of VA. We made 2 findings. First, that the award of CSIs to nearly all VACO senior executives in VHA and VBA was inconsistent with the PACT Act and VA policy based on the following. VHA and VBA improperly grouped all VACO senior executives together, contrary to VA's own policy to narrowly define a group for incentive pay. The 148 VHA senior executives held 26 different occupational series, and the 34 VBA executives held 6. Next, the amounts awarded were determined without considering what was needed for retention. And further, VHA provided no market factors in support of its CSIs. VBA's justification was based on flawed assumptions without analysis. The second OIG finding was that VA's internal controls were ineffective to prevent the improper awards. A series of failures and missed opportunities included: first, VHA did not provide the Secretary with its plan to pay CSIs to virtually all of its VACO senior executives. VHA had prepared a list of potential recipients and costs weeks before the Secretary asked for this information. VBA had provided the Secretary with the proposed costs of its award, but did not identify that it was awarding CSIs to virtually all its VACO senior executives. Second, the Office of Human Resources and Administration had to review the awards before issuance. Yet despite concerns raised by their own staff about the sufficiency of the justifications, HR&A leaders gave undue deference to VHA and VBA leaders and signed off on the awards without elevating or resolving staff concerns. As the former head of HR&A told our team, I was just a signature along the way. Third, the Office of General Counsel's review missed opportunities to identify legal issues apparent before the CSI awards were made. And fourth, because existing VA governance groups were not engaged, the Office of Management and other key stakeholders were not included in the process for reviewing the proposed incentives. Secretary McDonough took prompt action to cancel the payments to VACO senior executives when he learned of them and asked the OIG to investigate the CSI award process. VA concurred with the OIG report's 8 recommendations. The OIG will monitor VA's progress on implementing all corrective action plans and efforts to prevent such failings in future incentive pay processes. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
We'd like to open up for questions. This time I'd recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Missel, the CSI scandal isn't a case of a few bad apples. It's a complete organizational failure. Can you explain what went into your decision to recommend the Secretary consider taking administrative action if he finds it necessary? And then a follow-up on that is that recommendation something that you do lightly?
Answering the last question, it is not a recommendation that we do lightly. Under the IG Act, we don't have any authority to take any kind of disciplinary action or even to recommend specific disciplinary action. And that's why in some of our reports, if we see potential wrongdoing by individuals, we may include a recommendation for the appropriate person to consider taking any action based on the work in our report.
Okay. So how big of a role do you think office politics, not Republican, Democrat, office politics, played in the senior executive bonuses? Your report discussed Mr. Jacobs wanting to keep up with Dr. Elnahal's health administrative bonuses. Is that correct?
That's correct. So it did look like looking at what others were doing played a really important role. Instead of saying, what's the intent of Congress? And is this meeting the intent of Congress? Rather, first it was determined that the field executives for VHA were going to get a bonus. Then they started discussing giving VHA executives at VACO that same bonus. When VBA heard about it, they said, well, if VHA is giving it, maybe we should consider it. And next thing you know, it was all done.
So what are the 3 conditions, according to the PACT Act, that must be met for VA to award CSI bonuses?
Okay, you must possess a high-demand skill or a skill that is at shortage, one of the 2 of those. So secondly, that skill has to be part of your duties and responsibilities. And 3, retaining that person or hiring that person serves a critical mission-related need for VA. So you have 3 elements there.
Okay, so how would you rate VA's ability to meet those criteria and how they proposed moving forward with these bonuses?
They didn't meet that criteria, and I'll just add, so that's the legislation. VA then issued policies to implement the legislation. Like, for instance, they said you can group individuals, but you must group them narrowly according to where they are. If you're going to be using high demand, you have to show us market analysis, why this really does it. And they VHA and VBA grouped them improperly. They were way too wide, and they didn't provide any market analysis as to why these incentives should be paid.
Which probably, I think you may have answered it already, but to my final question here. How did VA justify every single health benefit administrator, senior executive, receive a bonus? Everyone.
They gave the same explanation for each and every one. So they had one explanation for all the VBA executives, one explanation for all the VHA. So that's taking all those people who have different roles and responsibilities, grouping them all together and say, we think they should because of this reason, same thing on the other for another reason. Neither one of the explanations for why was adequate.
And as far as communication between both VA and VHA, there is actual email communications kind of putting this, that they're basically talking together to decide how to do this. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. All right, I've got no other questions, and I will yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Inspector General, thank you for being here today, and thank you to you and your staff for investigating the circumstances around these improper payments. And while there were many missteps leading to the approval of these CSIs for central office executives The lack of involvement from the VA Office of General Counsel seems central to many of the issues that arose throughout the processes of issuing these incentives. What steps should VA take to require leaders to engage with the Office of Inspector to require leaders to engage with the Office of General Counsel in the beginning of the process to interpret and implement important legislation such as the PACT Act?
I would note that in this situation, the VA policy did not require the Office of General Counsel to review it, but for the then acting Deputy Secretary saying that he wanted Office of General Counsel to review it, Office of General Counsel likely wouldn't have reviewed it. So this was a new authority, and you would think you would want to look at it very carefully as you're implementing it, including having people with legal expertise review it. So they did review it. We found that they missed opportunities and didn't give the proper advice here. And to answer your question on what can be done, one of our recommendations does call for OGC to be more involved in these kind of situations. So we'll follow up to make sure that's done.
And you're saying that current policy did not require OGC to be involved from the beginning, but in light of what this situation has brought to the surface, there should be reforms there, is what you're saying?
And that's one of our recommendations,
One of your
to have
recommendations.
OGC involved.
From your investigation, it seems like the OGC was engaged at various points in the process for granting CSIs. They were not necessarily given the full scope of information or asked the right questions that would have raised red flags for attorneys about how leaders plan to award them. So my question is, what steps can VA leaders take to ensure that their staff are providing the full scope of information and asking the right questions to OGC attorneys when engaging for advice?
VA leaders need to remind their staff that when engaging with OGC, you need to provide them all the information. I will say that OGC, although they didn't have everything, had enough information that should have identified the issues here and should have caused OGC to ask more questions. It's a two-way street. VA should be providing information, but if OGC doesn't think they have everything or has other questions, then they need to respond back, and that wasn't done in this situation.
So OGC itself could have been more diligent, is what you're saying here.
The information was there for OGC to identify the issues.
Inspector General, while there were many offices required to review or approve the issuances of these CSIs, your report noted that there was a lack of effective internal controls to effectively evaluate the approvals for the bonuses and ultimately stop the improper payments. How should VA redesign its review approval process and approval process for CSIs and other retention bonuses to ensure compliance with statute and legislative intent?
Our recommendations in the report do look just exactly to what you're talking about. We have 4 recommendations that we believe would be appropriate to redesign it so an issue like this does not occur again.
And who should be conducting the final review to ensure a requested CSI is justified and complies with VA policy?
The way the process worked is you have a proposing official. It then is reviewed by the Office of Human Resources and Administration, and then it goes to an approving official. That approving official, when he or she puts their signature on, they should have the information necessary to make that decision.
And who should be the ultimate approval authority for an employee to receive a CSI?
Under the statute, the Secretary can delegate to whoever he believes is appropriate to do so. He did this in this situation, so whoever the approving authority is as delegated should be signing off.
So in this case, it appears that there were some clear conflicts of interest as some of the leaders that were charged with providing technical reviews of the CSI packages received these awards themselves. So what are some steps that VA should consider adding to the CSI approval process to ensure that there isn't a bias or self-interest involved in determining who receives a bonus?
That's another recommendation that we have in the report, to have the OGC ethics group look at this and make any changes as appropriate. We will follow up to make sure that is done.
Well, thank you for your testimony. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Mr. Rosendahl.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you very much for holding this hearing. Inspector General Missel, thank you for testifying today and for the work done by your agency that you lead. The OIG does important work to serve veterans and the public by conducting meaningful, independent oversight of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Mr. Missel, the OIG report stated that Under Secretary Elnahal said at a conference that the VISN directors and medical center directors would be receiving a critical skills incentive at 25% across the board. This contrasted with a signed memorandum that previous day outlining the two-tiered approach, 25% for CSIs and for VISN directors and 20% for CSIs for medical center directors, and not a flat 25% at all. Then VHA Human Resources staff changed the memorandum to reflect the CSI of 25% across the board. Can you please elaborate on this further? Did the Undersecretary misspeak at the conference, result in a 5% increase for the medical center directors, or was the initial signed memorandum incorrect?
The initial signed memorandum was 20% for medical center directors, 25% for VISN directors. He told us in testimony that he didn't recall that and that he just announced the 25% for everybody. Nobody on his staff that we could find told him that we already have this signed paper. Rather, what they did is they created another document which then gave a 25% across the board for medical center directors and VISN directors.
So, first of all, I find that the memorandum was put out to award a flat fee like that without evaluation is improper anyway. Isn't there supposed to be an evaluation on each person receiving a critical skill incentive to include, and I'm reading from the language, the employee possess a high demand skill or skill that is in a shortage. Such skill is directly related to the duties and responsibilities of the employee's position, and employment of an individual with such a skill in such a position services a critical mission-related need of the department.
That's correct. What VA policy did is they added to that to say in certain situations it may be appropriate to group employees. But the policy went further to say they must be narrowly grouped to make sure they have the same job series and same position. So all housekeepers, et cetera. In this situation, the executives, both at VBA and VHA, had very different job series. And so therefore, it was not appropriate to group them all together to get to your point.
Sure. And so my other question is that this would be these bonuses, these critical skills incentives are supposed to be for retention and to make sure that we keep the finest quality employees here. And yet when I look at the records, it shows that VBA executives have a 2.4% turnover rate, and 60% of VBA SESs have worked at the VA for over 15 years. So we're not losing employees. Is that correct?
That's what we found, and we found there was no analysis as to whether or not it was necessary for these incentives for individuals or why they decided on 25% for each and every one.
So do you know who explicitly approved the updated memorandum in regards to what was referenced in the conference?
Dr. Elnahal signed it, signed
Okay.
that memorandum.
How much did this change in just that 5%? Do you know how much that change cost the
I
taxpayers?
think that was an extra $1 million. I may be a little off, but I believe it was $1 million.
Okay. The report outlined examples of employees working behind the scenes pushing for bonuses that were the same employees who received a bonus. Ranking Member Takano already referenced the same thing. And could you give us just some basic information about what recommendations you're making to make sure that this situation doesn't arise again?
Yes, one of our recommendations is to make sure that the Office of General Counsel has rules within their ethics group to make sure anybody who has a role in a policy that could benefit them financially is not involved, and that they have specifics on how to do that. So that's one of our recommendations, and we'll follow up to make sure it's done.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would yield back.
Thank you. Representative Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To me, I'm trying to get to at the very, very, very beginning of this and how it sort of all happened. So I'm just wondering, could the legislation have been written differently so that the interpretation of the legislation would have been more clear?
It's possible. The legislation gives a lot of authority and discretion to VA to determine things, like what is a critical skill, what is high demand. And VA did issue policies to try to interpret some of that. Like, for instance, for high demand, they said we need market analysis. And that wasn't done in this situation. So the legislation does give VA a lot of discretion.
So I don't want to oversimplify this, but it just seems to me that the criteria was pretty clear in terms of who should or who shouldn't, receive a bonus. And yet, somehow, the powers to be who were making these decisions seem to be pretty unclear about that criteria. So it seems as though what your investigation comes up with is that there was really, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there was really no malintent here or abuse of the process. It was just, between the layers of decision making, there was, the oversight wasn't there or the communication wasn't there somehow, some way. Is that still your conclusion? It just seems to me that if I was the decision maker and I was giving bonuses just across the board to everyone, understanding that these are taxpayer dollars, I would think, maybe I should I should fine tune this a little bit, that this is not going to have a good look. But that didn't seem to be the case.
We didn't see that at the decision maker level. They wanted to get the 25% bonus, then they tried to justify it. There were controls in place. The Human Resources Office had to review them. They did review it. Staff within Human Resources had real concerns, identified the problems here, elevated it to then head of the office, who then essentially ignored the concerns and just moved forward. So the controls that were in place just didn't work here. There were large failures there.
So the general counsel, one of your recommendations is that, they play a larger oversight role in this process. So it makes me wonder, around other issues and other things that are happening in the VA and where the general counsel should play a role. Is this consistent with in other areas where it's unclear what the role of the general counsel is?
We have seen that on occasion, and that's why one of our recommendations is to make sure the right lawyer looks at it. In this situation, you had more junior lawyers reviewing it who just missed the issues. Our recommendation is to make sure, for things that have reputational financial risk, to make sure you have a senior lawyer looking at this to make sure things are done properly.
So the idea of the secretary having the ability to delegate these responsibilities, I understand that came directly from the legislation. Is that a good idea?
I think to have it as broadly used as it is, I think it would be really difficult for one person to sign off on everybody. You need somebody who's closer to the recipient to understand if they deserve this kind of award.
So my staff, it's kind of clear, is giving me some notes here. But so the head of HR that you mentioned ultimately did not heed the warnings of their staff that these bonuses may be improper. So who was that?
It was former Assistant Secretary Gina Grosso, as well as her then deputy, Jeffrey Mayo.
And is she still employed with the department?
She is not.
She is not. And did she resign or?
I don't know the specific circumstances why she's no longer there.
But she's no longer there after this became public information
I believe she left at the end of last year.
at the end of last year. Thank you. I yield back.
Van Ort, Representative Van Ort.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming today. I really appreciate it. I just want to run a couple things by you real quick here. What did Secretary Hall say to you specifically about how this took place? Did he get an email with the list of folks?
He didn't recall. He said he got the email of the list of folks.
Yeah,
He then said he was on an airplane.
yeah, very busy. Check Raj. Okay.
Airplane had, the email had 3 tabs.
Yeah,
The first tab had about 20 names, the other tab had the rest, and then the third tab was the total.
would this be the first tab?
I believe that's
It
correct.
would be. I ask unanimous consent to enter that into the record. Would this be the other tab? Can we, just by volume?
I think that looks,
Yeah.
I can't see it, but that does look like it.
I asked unanimous consent to enter this into the record. So this is the one that,
Without objection.
thank you, Dr. Hall checked on, this tab.
That's what he told
But he
us.
seemed to miss this one, right?
He said he didn't open that.
Yeah, okay. What's the average retirement salary of a E7 that has served their country in training in peacetime and combat over 20 years?
I don't know that information.
I do. The answer is $34,810. So an E7 that has served their country for over 20 years will receive a pension of $34,810. If I look at tab 1 here, every single one of these bonuses exceeds that by at least $13,000. And if I look at this tab here, this one, and I go all the way down, right? Every single one of these bonuses exceeds an E7 who served their country in combat's retirement. The lowest one you got here is $38,584. That E7's retirement, male, female, doesn't matter who they are, $34,810. Okay. Could you agree that something is wrong here?
Our report found lots of things that were wrong.
Okay. So what I'm going to do, I just want to make sure that this is cleared up, because I spoke to Secretary Hall last night and today. I spoke to the Secretary today, and you're not really the person I want to talk to. I want to talk to the Secretary personally and publicly, and I'd like to also speak to Undersecretary Dr. Hall publicly, but he's not here. So I want to commend you for your work. You've done a good thing, and I believe that your department is putting the benefit, or excuse me, the welfare of veterans above a bureaucracy. And this is ironclad proof that the Veterans Affairs bureaucracy is putting themselves above our veterans. So with that, sir, again, thank you so much for your work, and I'll be standing by to speak to the Secretary when he's here.
Thank you.
With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, I understand the point that the gentleman is making by entering information in the record, but I just want to make sure, Mr. Chairman, that the documents entered in the record are appropriately redacted to remove personal identifiable information.
We will make sure that they are, absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, can I respond? I may.
Say again, I'm sorry.
I would say to this, or this to the ranking member, part of the reason this problem keeps happening is because we keep covering up people. We keep covering up their identification. Sir, this is publicly available information with every single person's name and department that received these bonuses that far exceeds the retirement, annual retirement for a person at the rank of E7 that served in combat. So unless this is illegal, I am asking to have this and this entered into the permanent record with these people's names. Time to end this. Mr. Takano.
The committee will use proper, appropriate legal things that we have to cover up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Luttrell? No? Okay. Mr. Self?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, you recommended at the end of your executive summary administrative actions as the secretary deemed necessary. You also told us that you will be following up. Does that include following up on whatever administrative actions the secretary takes?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. And earlier you were asked the question, how much did that add to the bill here? And you said about $1 million. I submit to you and to this committee, that is not really the issue. Dollars are the foundation of this issue, but we are discussing a leadership issue. We also heard earlier, and I'm not sure who said it, we're only talking about 0.3% are in this discussion. And again, I say, that's not the heart of the matter. This is a leadership issue from the beginning. Now, a question for you. We hear often that departments and agencies develop rules that are diametrically opposed to the will of Congress. Is that the case here, or was it just either ignorance or ignoring the policies? So please characterize the policies of the VA versus what happened here for us.
I don't think the policies that VA established in this situation were inconsistent with the legislation. What happened here was certain people at VA did not follow those policies, and thus the CSIs were awarded improperly.
Thank you, and I suspected that would be your answer, so everybody listen to what he said. This is not VA policy. This is VA leadership. There have been mentions of recouping, and I understand that there was a whole campaign to fight the recouping of these improper payments. And I know that you say that it's not your job to follow the recouping, you don't know how it's going, but do you see evidence that there is recouping going on in the VA?
We have heard that a significant amount of the funds that were paid out have been recouped, but as stated in the report, it was outside our scope, so that was just information we got beside the work we were doing.
What does it take to make that inside your scope?
We can make a decision that we can follow up with it to ensure it's done.
Because they violated the policies, I would suggest that it's probably within your purview to do that, because it's also in your recommendations. So I would suggest that that's within your purview, and I would ask that you do that. And I'll echo Mr. Van Orden. You're not the one I want to talk to. So I appreciate that, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Luttrell. You don't want to be recognized. Okay. I'm going to do a follow-up, and then if any others have questions, I got a couple here still. Did the OIG review any evidence that VACO SESs VSs continued to push for these bonuses after they were canceled by the Secretary?
I don't know if it was after they were canceled. There was a process that the Secretary provided where people could appeal it, but we do know that after the Secretary became aware of it and was concerned about it, that there was an effort by some within VHA to provide other justifications so that some of the senior executives at VHA could get the CSIs. That effort did not go very far and never did anything.
Okay. This is a question that if Dr. Elnahar and Jacobs worked for you, would you have confidence in it?
In this situation, I wouldn't have confidence in what they did. They weren't on top of the issues as they should have been.
Thank you. Thank you. Ranking Member, you have anything else for this witness?
No, sir.
Thank you, and we will go to the second panel.
Thank you.
Stay standing. The witnesses now, for our second panel, we have the Honorable Dennis R. McDonough, Secretary of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Mr. Secretary, if you would, can you please raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to provide is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Thank you, and let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Mr. Secretary, you're recognized for your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thanks so much for the opportunity to appear today. I think we submitted a statement last night. I'm happy to go straight to questions.
Wonderful. We will go right to questions. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. So, Mr. Secretary, in your press conference last week, you said despite the fact that Dr. Ulnahal and Mr. Jacobs still have your confidence, but at our January hearing that examined the VA's HR sexual harassment scandal, you testified you lost confidence in former Assistant Secretary Grasso and asked her to resign. What's the difference?
What I said at the time in the testimony here in this room in February was that among the issues I was concerned about, the performance of our Assistant Secretary included the CSI's issue. I've also said, and I've said this publicly, and I've said as much to the Inspector General, that even though I recognize that this was a series of massive mistakes, in fact, it was me who called you to tell you about it. It was me who asked the Inspector General to investigate it, and it was me who stopped and recouped now at this date about 92% of those payments. I continue to have confidence in our undersecretaries because of their strong performance and the performance of their team on the implementation of the many authorities that we have, and because of the forthright way we've handled this scandal, naming it, owning it, learning from it, including appearing before you today.
Okay, that's going to lead to my second question. I think you answered part of it, but you asked Ms. Grasso to resign last year shortly after you became aware of the scandal. It seems that she's the only one person being held accountable for this. The investigation looks like it was a calculated effort, and so should no one else be held accountable?
Yeah, look, I think it's a fair question, so I thank you for it. As I said, I had a range of concerns about the Assistant Secretary's performance. Second, this issue, pursuant to the recommendations that you've just heard of from the Inspector General, is continuing to be reviewed by the Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection and by the ethics team at OGC. Third, we have this entire process is an effort for us to get better at how we manage what we consider a sacred obligation to our veterans and the fiduciary responsibilities we have to the taxpayer. This hearing, the IG inspection, the entire effort is part of that accountability. Third and last, ultimately, these issues happened on my watch, and as I testified to you in March, I should be held to account for them.
So I think it was Representative Brownlee asked about the legislation. Maybe it wasn't clear. So with the VA's abuse of the CSI authority in record time, mind you, would you support congressional legislative control over VA from here on out when handing out CSIs, and that we should draft the language that is very, 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 very clear so that this does not happen in the future?
Look, I recognize that as part of the oversight effort, and this is why among the first calls I made, as I understood this, was to you, Mr. Chairman. I said to you when I took this job that I had hoped we'd not make mistakes, but I anticipated that we might, and that you would learn about those from me. And I think overwhelmingly I've been true to that with you. If you all think that it's appropriate to take a hard look at how we administer these, we'd like to work with you on that. That said, we are engaged in a very important effort, as outlined in the recommendations from the Inspector General, to look closely at all of the CSIs. I hope that we could have an opportunity to talk to you about that.
So before I finish up here with my questioning, and I do appreciate you calling as soon as you did, but the committee is also waiting on some other responses. Like, I've got 8 outstanding letters at this time. These are important topics, including the Atlanta situation with the police leadership down there and a sexual harassment charge.
Definitely.
Second Amendment rights, some of those things, and so I'm needing to get those in.
I hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, look, you've got my commitment on that. I think we've responded to a lot of letters.
Yeah, you have.
But I get it, and we endeavor every day to be better. We'll continue to do the same.
We may have another round, but ranking member, be recognized for questioning.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Secretary, I was glad to see that you issued a new directive in September that requires your approval for senior executive CSIs.
Correct.
Now, how will this process create better accountability for future CSI awards across the VA enterprise?
Well, in that instance, basically, any senior executive CSI has to come to me, but as is outlined in the testimony that the Inspector General just made, we are also, at his recommendation, looking at the policies in place to ensure the use of CSIs in the future advances the core goal of the law in the first instance. So making sure that there's appropriate justifications for who qualifies, ensuring that there's appropriate justifications for the market forces that we are up against, ensuring that the Office of General Counsel is at the table involved in those decisions. Those are 3 examples of particular changes that we're building on. We also have a body of other CSIs, including field CSIs, that will inform that policy making. And so each of these efforts are designed to ensure that we hold ourselves to account to you, to the Inspector General, his important report, and to the rest of the VA workforce, who is impacted, obviously, by how this was handled, and ultimately, most importantly, to veterans.
Thank you. So this new process will require a delicate balance. I just want to know how you're designing this process so that there's enough oversight to ensure that you're awarding these incentives to the employees who really deserve them, while also streamlining approvals so that the incentive is issued in a timely manner to prevent the employee from seeking a job elsewhere. So, I mean, you can see that tension there. Do you think you achieved that?
I think that we will achieve that. I think if one were to just look at the overall awarding of CSIs outside of this very specific, very badly handled set of CSIs for senior executives in headquarters. Through April 30th of this year, we've awarded 41,289 CSIs. That's for a total spend of about $340 million of incentive. The average award is about $8,319. Overwhelmingly, that was provided to housekeepers, to food service workers, to police, and to HR specialists. Consequently, retention rates are the highest they've been in years. Quit rates at the lowest they've been in years. So we have demonstrated our ability to find that balance. However, we have to make sure that we learn the lesson on this so that we invest those taxpayer resources carefully and that we advance the interests of the veteran, because at the end of the day, that's what this is about, is having the personnel on board to carry out high-quality care and timely access to benefits for our veterans.
Well, thank you. And I just may add that the human resources specialists, in my view, that's a super critical area. They've been the linchpin of whether or not we're able to onboard people in a timely manner or we lose them. So, I mean, that's a real critical, and so I'm glad to hear that this has been useful in retaining those employees. Do you feel that your agency, do you feel as though your agency not having a Senate-confirmed general counsel contributed to the misinterpretation of Congress's legislative intent?
In candor, I don't. I think that I hope that we are creating a atmosphere in VA where when somebody sees something that doesn't make sense, that they speak up. I think that happened in the case in September 13th when I received a call from the Financial Service Center through our chief financial officer. I was home with COVID that day, and they blew the whistle because they saw these large payments going out of the Financial Service Center. That was speaking truth to power. That was calling out a challenge. That was an important internal check, one we rely on a regular basis. And I hope that I do a better job of creating an atmosphere where everybody can speak their mind. In this case, I think Mike spelled out in his the Inspector General spelled out in his very important report the fact that lawyers did get notified and could have spoken up. And at the end of the day, there's blame to go around here, but the blame rests with me. I should have put this into the governance structure that I've built, that I've insisted on since I got in VA. And ultimately, that's why I feel it's important to be here with you today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that answer. I yield back, sir.
Mr. Rosendale.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Secretary McDonald, thank you so much for being here today. I have to tell you that out of all the committees that I serve on, and all the people that come before us, I give you credit. You always come in here and take the licks when we're asking the difficult questions. Even whether
Not the
we
funnest
agree or not, you are always here. I appreciate you taking ownership and testifying before the committee. However, I wish we had an opportunity to hear directly from Undersecretary Elnahal and Undersecretary Jacobs, as their actions raise the most questions. When do you think that we'll be able to have them before us?
Look, I thought it was important for me to come because for the reasons I've just spelled out, which is I feel responsible for this. And,
And I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I truly do. However, the members on this committee, I assure you, they had the direct questions for Undersecretary Elnahal. They want to hear directly from the horse's mouth. Obviously, being in charge of the Veterans Administration, then you ultimately have to direct everything.
Right.
But they are the ones that took the actions and directed what took place, and that's why we really need to have them in here.
I think our entire agency, we've tried to be available to the committee. We've tried to be responsive to and transparent with the committee. I get it that we have some back and forth where we fight about that, but I think the founders had that in mind when they created this Articles 1 and Articles 2 of the Constitution. So I have every expectation that they'll continue to come up here before this committee. So, and I've noticed that you never withhold on your questions. So, but I thought it was very important for me to be here to.
Again, we just want to make sure that the people who took those actions are here to answer the questions. So as soon as soon as you can urge them to be before us, it would be greatly appreciated.
We'll continue to be transparent with this committee and engage with this committee, absolutely.
Okay, the OIG report states that you didn't learn about the central office's executives had received the CSIs until alerted by VA CFO on September 13th, 2023, despite specific requests regarding the planned use of incentives in the months before they were awarded. This is the second time that there's been a major incident that you were unaware of. But to your credit, both times, you did start trying to put some actions in place to address it. I understand there's approximately 400,000 employees at the VA, and you can't know everything. However, Has there been any consideration in changing some of the internal processes to ensure that you're made aware of these things earlier to prevent issues like this from even happening?
Look, I think this is why we changed delegation in September. The chairman pointed that out several minutes ago. This is why we are reviewing the entire process on these, and this is why I'm trying to create, I want to create and this is why I think it's important for me to be here today, to demonstrate to our workforce that I own this, and I want to be in a position where I'm hearing directly from them, because I'm here accountable to you.
So my understanding is that you canceled the CSIs to 182 VHA and VBA, VACO SESs, but did not cancel the CSIs to the 197 field executives.
Correct.
So why did you not cancel the CSIs for the 197 field executives? And why did we not, at a minimal, not reevaluate them utilizing the formal procedure that was put in place?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Rosendale. We're obviously reviewing this. This is one of the recommendations that the Inspector General has put to us. By the same token, we have begun to review and had begun to review those field CSIs.
So had
And
they been
frankly-
notified that the 197 that we have not rescinded those bonuses? Had they been notified that those bonuses and the procedure that was utilized to award them is being reviewed?
Remember that these were two different procedures, okay? And that's the point I was just about to make, which is that the justifications for the field CSIs overwhelmingly, now I'm not ready to opine on this completely because the review is ongoing, but the evidence to date suggests they were handled in a process much more consistent with the policy that we laid out in 2023, meaning with individual justifications based on those individuals with specific market analyses to make the case that this is a particular skill in those markets to keep those personnel. And this is broadly speaking, a category of executive that we've been talking to the committee about as an agency for many years, including years before I got here, because we have churn among network directors and VAMC directors. And so I think I have believed and continue to believe that those investments are important to keep that critical leadership cadre. In fact, we've also invested in additional executives, not through incentives, but by creating additional executives in the field so that there are deputy network directors, so that the network director in 19, for example, Sunena, was able to be elevated with a firm succession plan after our earlier network director, Mr. Gallucci, retired. Our ability to have...
My time has expired, Mr. Secretary, and I'm going to yield back before I get myself in the trouble with the chairman.
Sorry.
Representative Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you, Mr. Secretary.
Ma'am.
So the Inspector General report says that VA concurred with both findings and all recommendations and has provided acceptable action plans and completion timelines.
Yes.
So what are the timelines?
Well, the timelines in the report, I think he asked by the end of September. Is that? I can ask the Inspector General, but we've had much of this work underway, so we anticipate we'll be rolling back with answers to the Inspector General's recommendations. And I've said to him, in the event that there's any deviations on this, that we'll obviously be continuing to converse with him throughout this process. So it's not like a one final test. It's we're going to continue to try to meet the goals laid out in the requirements laid out in the report.
So you mentioned that 92% of the bonuses have been returned to the VA. What about the 8%? What's going on there?
Yeah, I might just walk down this if you don't mind. Now, we have a slightly different number here because the Inspector General included for his analysis those CSIs that had been awarded, but that I stopped before the award was paid out. So if you hear different numbers, you'll understand why. Right now, the finance agency, DFAS, which we use to pay our salaries, has collected $9.1 million of the $9.9 in CSI debts. Those are debts that have been, those are $9.9 million in payments to those 175 executives, okay? We've recouped we've recouped $9.1 million. 7 executives requested restructured biweekly repayment plans, and of those, 3 executives are being actively collected against, and 4 are on hold pending a hearing, because the employees have rights there. 3 executives did not request a debt hold or restructured repayment plan and have the automatic 15% disposable, net disposable income being deducted biweekly. And 17 executives had collection on hold pending their hearing. There was 12 requests for a hearing. And 5 had requests for waivers. Those hearings and those waiver decisions have recently been completed, so those additional 17 individuals will begin the recoupment process. So that gives you how we get to the full amount of the payments that were, the incentive payments that were made.
So there were no outright refusals to return bonuses?
No, there was a request for hearings, and we published the process by which we had those hearings, and there's requests for waivers. Those waivers were reviewed, those hearings were conducted, and as I said, we have 92% of the outlaying dollars returned, and we're working through the final 8%.
So once, everything has sort of been corrected, are you planning on going back and to evaluate those management folk and give them a bonus based on what the criteria truly was? I would imagine you sort of have a morale problem based on some of this. I don't know how widespread that might be, but... Yeah,
well, I mean, I thought it was, I noted in a letter that we got from Mr. Self, and I heard Chairman Boss' opening statement that they had the benefit of hearing from one of our employees. I think that's good that our employees feel that they have an outlet. I spend a lot of time with our teams. I don't want to characterize it one way or the other. I want to underscore one more time that I think our workforce is the best workforce in the federal government. I think they're doing really important work. I think absent our headquarters SES, we would right now be paying out about 1 presumptively service-connected disability associated with the PACT Act. In fact, we're paying out many more than 30. Without our SES in headquarters, we would not be providing access to VA healthcare absent a service connection under Section 103 of the Act until 2032. We've been doing it for 6 months. So I think that is a good team. I think they're doing good work. There are, included in there are leaders who continue to see patients, including psychologists, for example. I'm proud of their work. If we were to go back to look at CSIs, we'd do it in the light of the day, with the full visibility of any new policies, informed by our conversations with this committee and its important oversight responsibilities.
Well, I agree with you that, there are a lot of good people in the VA that are doing a great job. I guess, I'm asking the question, there was a purpose in this policy of which I thought was a good purpose. Certainly I've experienced that turnover with LA Medical Center, my own CBOC within my district, and so I understand the consequences of those turnovers. So I think it's a good policy.
Yes.
So all I'm asking is, wouldn't you want to go back and evaluate to honor those people that we want to keep on board who are doing a good job, and they should not be victims of bad decision making?
Definitely, but what I've said, I think I think the Inspector General referred to town halls that I had with the workforce last September and October, and I continue to have these conversations in the field with the workforce. What I've said to people is it's hard for me to read the statute and conclude that there's no executives in headquarters that could qualify for a CSI. And consistent with that, we will look at that if there are places we need a CSI. Similarly, there is no way to read the statute to conclude that every senior executive in headquarters
Yeah, absolutely.
need a deserved one.
absolutely.
So again, if we go back to look at it, it will be very specific, individual and skill driven, and it will be pursuant to the new policies that we're putting in place as a result of the Inspector General's report and all of our learnings since last summer.
I yield back.
Representative Van Orton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to frame this thing in a way that people can understand. The relationship between you, the VA, veterans, this committee, the American people, and me. You are President Obama's former chief of staff, correct?
Yes, correct.
I was the first Republican challenger in the nation that Donald Trump endorsed in 2022. Can't really get farther apart than that. Secretary Anna Hall has called me personally multiple times when there's been issues with the VA, particularly with the Toma VA, because that's in my district. Everything from laboratory equipment not being calibrated properly to a personal issue with one of my constituents who unfortunately died due to something that happened with the VA. You have personally called me when there's been issues with housing stipends for veterans, multiple other issues. You've called me personally. But I'm going to say something now publicly that's been private for a long period of time so that people truly understand who you are. My daughter died this summer. Several members of Congress, Aaron Bean, Mike Collins, Kevin McCarthy, and Mark from Missouri, Alford from Missouri came. And we're all sitting there, and that funeral was about to start. And there was a bit of a kerfuffle, and you walked in the church. You didn't tell me, you didn't tell anybody. You came to my daughter's funeral, unannounced, as just a civilian and as a man. And that speaks to your character. It does, and I respect it tremendously. I'll never forget that. This is why what I'm going to say is so incredibly painful to me personally. The average E7 gets $37,810 a year retirement. Your department awarded these folks, this entire list of people, more than that in one fell swoop, and that's wrong.
I agree with that.
You said earlier I should be held accountable. I took the opportunity to write a resignation letter for Mr. Anna Hall, and it's addressed to you, and it's about this issue. And I spoke to him last night, I spoke to him again this morning, I spoke to you. Isaiah 1:18 says, "Come now, let us reason together," right? So it's time that we talk. And I cannot justify Mr. Anna Hall serving in the capacity that he does now. I can't. And all these things are very important questions and whatnot. But I cannot justify his employment any longer. So, Mr. Secretary, I'm going to give you the opportunity to do what you just asked to do, to be held accountable. And I'm going to change this from Dr. Anna Hall to Secretary Dennis McDonough. I'm going to change it from Secretary Dennis McDonough to President Biden, because this is a systemic problem, and I do not think that you are capable of serving in this capacity any longer. And that breaks my heart to say that, but I believe that to be true. And I say that with the utmost respect. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Representative Lensman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Secretary, thank you for being here. Mr. Rosendale mentioned this earlier, but you do come when necessary and answer questions, taking responsibility, and I clearly we all appreciate that. Trust is a big part of what we're talking about here, and it's at the core of whether or not veterans are going to come to the VA. And whether they come to the VA may determine a whole host of things, including their own lives, right? They get not just job opportunities and education opportunities, but healthcare and those supports. And so we want to ensure that our veterans are coming. When I was a teacher, my first day of teaching, somebody pulled me aside, a veteran teacher who said, look, you can, have all the pedagogy in the world in terms of how to teach. But if the students don't trust you, they're not going to learn anything. And she likened it to a teacher who has a fire hose, and the students all have raincoats on. And that's the job, is to get them to take the raincoats off so that they can, understand, learn. And it was a really profound story, and I was glad she did it on the first day, because from that day and that day forward, I focused on building those relationships. And so clearly, this gets at trust, and obviously there are folks who are going to have to be held accountable. And to your point, it starts with you. So the Inspector General has laid out these recommendations. Can you talk us through the timeline and what we should expect? And as a committee member who's really interested in ensuring that we sort of get on the other side of this, having built more trust, what that would look like from our standpoint.
Yeah, look, I think it's really important, and I appreciate the question. I just want to give you 3 facts, and then I'll answer the question. One, trust in VA right now is measured out any number of vectors, is the highest it's been since we began measuring trust in VA. 2, we have each of the last 3 years had filed and resolved historically large numbers of claims, because veterans are choosing to file claims with us. And 3, in the last year, we have enrolled more new veterans month by month than we have in a number of years, because veterans are choosing to come to a place that they trust to get their care. So you are absolutely right, that trust is an important, absolutely important metric of whether we're succeeding or not. As it relates to me holding our agency to account to you, to the Inspector General, and to our veterans on his report, which I asked for, you have my commitment that we will get those 8 recommendations done this year. That's a commitment I've made to Mike, and we'll stay in touch with your staffs and with you personally to the extent that you want to, as we implement those policies to be responsive to him.
Yeah, thank you. That helps to know it'll happen this year. I think it would be great, you may already be doing that, but laying out the 8 recommendations. Yes. And sort of how you're approaching the pursuit of those recommendations. Yes. And what we should expect maybe it's biweekly or monthly updates.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. That's in my submitted testimony, the specific steps we're taking on each of the 8. And we can get into which of our senior leaders is leading each of those as you want.
I think that piece would be great so that we know who to reach out to if there are questions or concerns. Anyways, thank you very much for everything you do. And
Thank you.
With that, I yield back.
Okay, the gentleman yields back, Mr. Luttrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, good to see you today, sir. To Mr. Lansman's point, I'm just curious, do the undersecretaries, I'm sure they have to appreciate, I mean, you're the one, and again, the rest of the committee members have said this, I mean, buddy, you saddle up. I mean, every single time there's been a bloodshot to the VA, you're showing up and you're taking it right on the chin, and I commend that. That's the absolute definition of a leader. You're not walking away from this. I'm curious, does it feel like that if you're going down inside the organization, because of the breadth and scale of this issue that we're talking about today, have they come to you and said, hey, look, we really jacked up, we're sorry? Yes. Or has there been any kind of...
Absolutely. And they've gone to their teams to make the same acknowledgments. And importantly, they're not just saying it, but they're living it. And I admire their candor on that.
Okay, can we talk about always kind of consequences of actions in here? And I don't see Mr. Crane in here yet, but I'm sure if he comes in when we round this corner, you're gonna get an earful about it.
I have every
Get ready. But I want to talk about, so you and I are on the same page 100% when suicide prevention is the #1 issue in the VA.
Yes.
Right? I mean, we lose sleep over that at night.
Yes.
And as much as I've been reading on this issue that we're talking about right now, here, I want to try to put this in perspective. I'm sure you have it, sir, but so in the mental health and suicide prevention in the office in the department in VA, so the director of continuous care and general health makes around $300,000 a year, all right? And the CSI was $76,000-ish that was paid out. Now, here's my problem. So what was the suicide rate at last year for veterans?
We had more than 6,500 suicides, so I don't remember the rate.
The numbers are continuously going up. They're not decreasing.
They had been going down, I think.
They went down
last
in
year.
20,
Yeah.
but they jumped back up.
Right.
We had this conversation.
Correct.
So
Correct.
the system itself is failing. I don't have a problem saying it. The system itself is absolutely failing our veterans. And I don't walk away from the challenges of emotional distress and cognitive instabilities. I don't. It's a very hard pulse to catch.
Yeah.
But the executive director for suicide prevention received almost $50,000 in CSI. The deputy director for field support and analytics, which has been in office since 2016, got $48,000. And then the deputy director received almost $50,000. Now, I'm pretty sure you probably yanked all this back, but my point is we just rewarded these people for failure.
So, look,
Now, I'm sure, and you're gonna try to explain this to me, that's...
I get it, and I guess I want to say the following, which is all the CSIs that went to senior executives have been taken back.
Okay, thank you.
2, though the people in these jobs are people, not every one of them, and that was my point earlier, which is that you cannot read the statute and say that this was an acceptable use of that statute. However, there are people with very critically important skills to veterans. A senior psychologist who's dedicated his life to taking care of these guys.
I'm tracking that
And so-
100%, Mr. Secretary,
right,
but I'm going to argue with you all day long. If the numbers continue to go up over the decade after decade, that particular individual is not doing a good enough job for our veterans. And giving them bonus money for that is a slap in the proverbial face of all the veterans walking around outside and the families that are left behind, period.
Yeah, except each of that, I'm not gonna try to defend that we're succeeding here, but I am gonna tell you that we have a team that is working this extraordinarily hard. And they could walk away from this and go as a psychologist, psychiatrist, be remunerated at 3x somewhere else. And they're choosing, because of their love of this mission, and because of their love for those veterans and their survivors, they're they're investing that skill here. Now, does that mean I'm comfortable that we're succeeding? I am not comfortable with that. But we won't succeed without them.
We're not succeeding with them.
I'm telling you that those guys.
And this is an end, sir. We're 15 rounds on this one.
I understand.
But these numbers are what I have to explain to my veterans and the families back home, plain and simple. And this is what I'm hearing. And I wish those two were sitting here in front of me and not you, sir. Because they're the ones I need to be talking to. You're up here sweeping it up. You're trying to do best with your department and make it the best department ever. Hands down, I think arguably the best secretary Mr. Biden has. I say that out in front of God and everybody, all right? But
I hear you.
I yield back, sir.
I hear you.
Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Sull from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, you are a very affable fellow, very polished. But I'll quote one of our space missions. We have a problem. The last hearing you were at, that we had a conversation, you and I had a conversation about Secretary Shinseki. You called him a hero. And I asked what response you were going to have to that scandal. Here we are again. Here we are again. In everything that you say and everything that Mr. Luttrell credits to you about trying, it only takes one to ruin morale in a unit. It only takes one. We've had at least 2 major ones here, scandals. So all of the good work can be undone in a moment of time. I want to go to the executive summary of the OIG. Dr. Elnahal deceived you. Let's just be honest. You asked for additional information from both Elnahal and Jacobs about their plans to pay CSIs to senior executives. You expressed concerns about the cost of the incentives and your desire to make sure the authorities were used with care. In response, and I'm quoting now from the OIG report, Dr. Elnahal did not disclose to the secretary, that's you, the plan for VHA central office executives, the central point of this discussion, but rather provided information solely on the CSIs for field executives. He deceived you. There is no other way. You were just talking about trust. It confounds me how you can have trust after the OIG recorded that the man deceived you. I won't ask what it's probably not proper for me to ask what administrative actions you have, but you've told us that you plan to implement, that you plan to enact the recommendations by the OIG. One of them, toward the end, is any administrative actions that you deem necessary, I think was the words that they used. And you have a commitment. You just made a commitment to this committee that you're going to follow through on them. And again, I won't ask you what your administrative actions that you have planned are, but it looks to me like today you should have brought us either the resignation letter or the termination letter for Elnahal, Jacobs, and I hope I get this name pronounced right, Bongiorni, HR, because she's the one that actually instigated the payment to the central office. And lastly, I will bring up the fact that at least 3 of the assistant secretaries that got these CSIs have been the target of committee investigations. One was trying to ban the VJ Day kiss photo, received a $57,000 bonus. The whistleblower, the executive that was retaliated against the subordinate whistleblowers received $52,000 bonus. The chief of Office of Disability and Medical Assessment, who your own investigations found harassed subordinates, received a bonus of $53,000. So I'm not sure I have any questions. I just would ask you, what are the hearing decisions? And we'll leave it at this. First of all, did you bring us those letters?
I did not.
Okay. I think I will yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
I might just say, if it's, can I respond, or?
Yes, Mr. Secretary, please do so.
In the case of the OMBI, we've found, and the committee also found 3 individuals to have been engaged in that misconduct. Those 3 individuals, we began proceedings to separate them from VA. They're no longer at VA. There's 3 other individuals who were involved in that activity that are no longer with VA. In the case of the CSIs, none of the executives is keeping the CSI payment. 92% of those payments have been recouped in their entirety, and we will get the other 8%. Moreover, for example, this is why I think the accountability efforts are so important. You cited one individual who was cited in press reports as being involved in the issue about the photo. She was not. She was absent on leave when that decision was made. And her name was attached to that decision, which, when I learned of it, I rescinded immediately. That photo is still up at VA facilities. So it is true we make mistakes. Nobody makes more of them than me. But when I make them, I come here. I alert you to them. And I own them. And we have a very dedicated workforce at VA, in the field and in headquarters. And did we make mistakes here? We did.
Mr. Secretary, I did not ask for your resignation. I asked for the resignation of 3 other, or termination of 3 other members.
I've asked my Democrat colleagues and Republicans if they'd like a second round of questioning, and they don't. So we're going to close here, but I just have to say some things here. I want to reiterate what Mr. Luttrell said about veteran suicide. This committee has allocated $120 billion since 9/11 for veteran suicide prevention, $1.6 billion this last fiscal year, and the suicide rate is increasing. And you're responsible for giving a bonus to the person that's in charge of increasing veteran suicide. That's reality. Platitudes don't count. We go to funerals. We look at kids whose parents are dead in the eye because of your failure of leadership at the VA. That's reality. You said that we're not going to succeed with the folks that without the folks that you have. Mr. Luttrell aptly pointed out, you're failing with them. So what's the difference? You guys have taken the my bad defense. You said 92% of all of these payments have been recouped. The reason 92% have been recouped is because you guys got busted. You got rolled up hard. 0% of all of these monies would have been recouped if you were not caught red-handed. That's also a fact.
I stopped them.
Mr. McDonough, you have a choice, and it's binary. You and Mr. Anahal can become the face of everything that everybody hates about Washington, D.C. Corruption, cocktail parties, institutions above individuals, literally paying millions of dollars to each other for failing. Or you can stand up like the man that I know you are personally. You're a man of character. So is Mr. Anahal. You can stand up now or speak to your subordinates and have them tenure their resignation, and you can turn a new leaf. You can start a new chapter in government accountability. You do come up here and you take heavies all the time. It means nothing. It means nothing because our veterans are killing themselves. Drug and alcohol addiction skyrocketing, spousal abuse skyrocketing, mental health issues skyrocketing. All under your watch, sir, and Mr. Anahal's watch. So the binary choice is this: be remembered in history as someone who has abjectly failed, or be the new start. Recreate the government and be accountable and stand up for the person that I know you are. I ask unanimous consent that all members shall have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material. Hearing no objections, so ordered. This hearing is now adjourned.